Ports here in Southern California account for 30% of the nation's exports, 40% of the nation's imports, and about half of the business. What's your assessment of the situation right now? We had a couple of ships come in yesterday, unload, and then depart. And so once again, as of today, we have 0 ships at the at-burst right now at the port of Seattle. Nearly $50 billion in US GDP could be lost if the ongoing port crisis continues to escalate. Major shipping hubs like Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Seattle are reporting an unprecedented decline of up to 40% in import volumes. Perhaps even more alarming, container bookings from China have dropped by nearly 50% in just a single month. A staggering collapse in trade activity from the United States' largest source of imports. And this isn't the result of war. It's not a global pandemic. The cause is far more deliberate US tariffs on Chinese goods, now reaching as high as 45%, have triggered a full-blown disruption in the nation's shipping sector. What once were bustling ports are now eerily quiet, turned into ghost towns by a policy earthquake. The central question has shifted. It's no longer when will shipments arrive. Now it's can the US supply chain survive this at all? At the heart of America's shipping crisis are its most critical trade arteries, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which together handle roughly 40% of all inbound containerized cargo entering the United States. Normally teeming with activity cranes, swinging trucks lining up, and ships queued offshore, these ports now echo with silence. Terminal activity has plunged, with reports showing sharp declines in vessel traffic and container volume directly linked to a collapse in orders from Asia, especially China. Further north, the picture is just as bleak. The ports of Seattle and Tacoma, once vital gateways for Pacific trade, have seen weeks pass without a single new vessel docking. Satellite imagery and industry tracking data confirm that berths are empty and container stacks remain stagnant. These aren't just logistical blips, they are systemic breakdowns that reveal the broader unraveling of America's import ecosystem. What was once a symbol of the country's economic strength and trade dominance has turned into a haunting reflection of policy-induced paralysis. The sharp reduction in port throughput is not due to technical failure or labor disputes. It is the consequence of deliberate trade policy. The 145% tariffs on Chinese imports imposed under the Trump administration have made key goods prohibitively expensive, leading to widespread order cancellations and shipping lane disruptions. Now, entire port regions, some of the busiest in the Western Hemisphere, resemble ghost towns. The visuals are stunning. Row upon row of unused cranes, parking lots filled with idle trucks, and loading docks without dock workers. This eerie transformation isn't just symbolic, it's economically devastating. These ports are not only trade hubs, they are the beating hearts of regional economies that rely on constant throughput to sustain jobs, small businesses, and infrastructure investment. The crisis is quiet, but it is profound. A slow-motion collapse hidden in plain sight, unfolding along the country's most critical coastlines. And, unless addressed, these ghost ports may be the first signs of something even more destructive: the long-term erosion of America's logistical competitiveness. As America's ports go quiet, the shockwaves are radiating deep into the logistics ecosystem, crippling the very infrastructure that keeps the US economy moving. Truck drivers, dock workers, and warehouse staff, the essential workforce behind every shipment and stocked shelf, are now facing mass layoffs, reduced hours, and operational standstills. The slowdown in port activity has cut off the flow of work they rely on, forcing many into unemployment or underemployment with no clear timeline for recovery. Logistics firms across the country are reporting catastrophic losses, with revenue declines ranging from 40% to 60%, according to industry reports cited in the video. Many smaller operators, particularly independent trucking businesses and regional freight services, have already filed for bankruptcy or temporary closure, unable to absorb the sudden disappearance of demand. Without stable volumes, these companies simply cannot sustain fuel costs, payroll, or warehouse overhead. Compounding the crisis is a growing number of abandoned or unclaimed containers piling up in distribution centers. These units, once filled with merchandise destined for store shelves, now sit idle waiting for buyers who never materialized, or retailers who can't afford the new tariff-driven prices. In major hubs across the West Coast, storage yards are reaching capacity, even as incoming shipments continue to stall. The result is a paradox of oversupply in transit and shortage in stores. Indeed, retailers are already sounding the alarm with supply chains breaking at both ends, inputs stuck at origin, and outputs marooned in logistical limbo. Store shelves are beginning to thin out. Consumer-facing brands, particularly in electronics, home goods, and apparel, are struggling to secure enough stock to meet demand. The risk of seasonal shortages and price surges is rising fast. And as inventories dry up, inflationary pressure will accelerate. This isn't just a shipping problem. It's a systemic bottleneck that threatens every stage of the US economy, from global sourcing to last-mile delivery. And unless there is swift policy intervention or a strategic realignment of trade flows, America's logistics engine may not just stall, it could seize completely. Beneath the surface of America's idle ports lies a far more dangerous tremor, a nationwide economic aftershock that could rattle every corner of the US economy. Experts now warn that if the shipping and supply chain crisis persists, the cumulative impact could slash as much as $50 billion from the country's GDP. And unlike previous shocks triggered by natural disasters or pandemics, this one is largely self-inflicted, rooted in policy decisions and their cascading fallout. The port paralysis and logistics breakdown are not just slowing down commerce. They're constricting the arteries of the consumer economy, as inventory shortages ripple through retail price pressures are building fast. Analysts are projecting a 2% to 3% rise in overall inflation, with certain product categories, particularly those heavily reliant on Chinese imports, facing price surges of up to 20%. Everyday goods like electronics, kitchen appliances, furniture, and even clothing may soon become significantly more expensive or outright unavailable. The timing couldn't be worse. With core inflation already elevated, consumer confidence remains fragile. Add to this visible price hikes and empty shelves, and you have the makings of a crisis that directly touches household budgets and spending behavior. The result, a potential slowdown in consumer activity, which could further contract GDP, amplify recession fears, and put financial pressure on working and middle-class families already stretched thin. But this isn't just about inflation or GDP numbers. It's about the strategic integrity of the national supply chain. The current calm at US ports is misleading. While the docks may appear quiet upstream, factories in Asia are pausing. Production shipments are stalled mid-route, and downstream retailers are scrambling for alternatives. It's a classic case of what supply chain analysts call a silent storm, where visible activity slows while systemic stress builds to a breaking point. In short, the economic pain from the port crisis is no longer theoretical. It's here, it's spreading, and without immediate intervention, it may escalate into one of the most consequential trade-related disruptions the US has seen in decades. While the current slowdown at US ports paints a grim picture of supply chain paralysis, economists and logistics experts are already sounding the alarm about a second, potentially more chaotic wave, the whip effect. This term, often used in supply chain theory, refers to the sudden surge in backlogged shipments that can overwhelm logistical systems or after a period of suppression. And it's exactly what the United States may soon face. Right now, the 145% tariffs on Chinese goods that sparked the original disruption have been temporarily suspended for 90 days. A pause that offers short-term breathing room but no long-term resolution. Once that window closes, if the tariffs are reinstated without adjustment or renegotiation, hundreds of delayed shipments could flood back into the US like a dam breaking. Carriers, importers, and manufacturers are already stockpiling and timing freight movements to coincide with this decision. The likely result, a tidal wave of container traffic surging all at once into already understaffed, under-resourced ports. The consequences could be catastrophic. Port terminals may buckle under the strain with limited labor equipment and storage capacity to handle the backlog. Ships may be forced to anchor offshore for days or even weeks, awaiting berths to unload a throwback to the darkest days of the pandemic-era supply chain crisis. In this scenario, terminal congestion will lead to delays across every mode of transportation, rail, truck, and air freight. Inventory plans will unravel, warehouses will run out of space. Retailers expecting replenishment will face stockouts and missed sales windows, particularly damaging for seasonal or perishable goods. The costs of demurrage and detention fees will spike, and carriers may reroute or even cancel voyages to avoid profit loss. What makes the whip effect so dangerous is its compounding nature. Every delay causes a cascade of failures downstream. What begins as a port scheduling issue quickly becomes a national logistics emergency. And because the infrastructure and labour pool haven't been scaled to absorb this shock, the system could lock up entirely, mirroring a digital bottleneck in a physical world. In essence, this second wave could do more than disrupt trade. It could expose the fragility of America's logistics architecture built for efficiency, not resilience. Without strategic planning and preemptive coordination, the whip effect may hit faster and harder than the first disruption ever did. At the center of America's shipping and supply chain crisis lies a deliberate policy choice: economic nationalism. Under President Donald Trump, the administration implemented sweeping tariffs up to 145% on Chinese goods, with the stated goal of protecting American industries and reducing reliance on foreign manufacturing. The strategy aimed to reshore production, encourage domestic sourcing, and punish what the administration viewed as unfair trade practices by China. In theory, the approach was framed as a defense of American jobs and economic sovereignty, but in practice, it triggered a highly disruptive chain reaction across global trade networks, a reaction that continues to reverberate years later. China is not just any trade partner. It's the largest supplier of finished goods and intermediate components in the US import portfolio. From electronics to industrial machinery, from textiles to packaging materials, Chinese exports are deeply embedded in America's commercial ecosystem. By sharply curbing these imports through punitive tariffs, the policy destabilized the very supply chains that American companies depend on to operate competitively. Small and medium-sized businesses, many of which don't have the scale or capital to rapidly shift sourcing, have been hit particularly hard. Industries like automotive parts, consumer electronics, retail manufacturing, and even agriculture, which depends on Chinese inputs like fertilizers and chemicals, have faced steep input cost hikes, production delays, and lost contracts. Moreover, the move failed to address the underlying structural weaknesses of the US industrial base without parallel investments in domestic capacity. Retraining programs or incentives for reshoring the void left by reduced Chinese imports has not been filled. Instead of sparking a manufacturing renaissance, the policy created a vacuum one that crippled downstream sectors and exposed the fragility of just-in-time logistics models. Perhaps most paradoxically, the businesses that the tariffs were intended to protect are now among the most vulnerable. American manufacturers that rely on global supply chains for components have faced rising costs, inventory shortages, and shrinking profit margins. Some have moved operations overseas entirely to escape tariff exposure, undermining the very principle of domestic protectionism. In essence, the 145% tariffs were not just an economic lever, they became a blunt instrument that sacrificed supply chain resilience in pursuit of political messaging. And now, with ports paralyzed, inflation rising, and logistics systems buckling, the costs of that economic nationalism are becoming painfully clear. As the dust settles over America's idle ports and silent logistics centers, one question looms larger than any policy paper or trade negotiation. If the goal of cutting imports was to protect American industry, but the outcome is the collapse of the very supply chains those industries rely on, then who exactly is being protected? The United States now stands at a crossroads.